ask you to put your comments in the chat box, especially during meditation, cares, concerns, and celebration. For those of you on Zoom, we will gather together in small groups after the service for coffee time. May your heart be open.
Good morning, and I also would like to welcome you to the service we have closest to Valentine's Day. Reverend Karen was hoping I would do something with hearts and flowers, but instead you're getting a history lesson of sorts, but it does end with a marriage. So, in the meantime, I invite those of you on Zoom to light your own chalices while Carol Lewis lights a chalice for us in the great room. Please join me in the words of Universalist minister John Murray. You possess only a small light, but uncover it, let it shine. Use it in order to bring more light and understanding to the hearts and minds of men and women. Give them not hell, but hope and courage. Our opening song, Forward Through the Ages, will help propel us through 20 centuries, actually, of Unitarian Universalist and Unitarian Universalist history. And our quartet will be singing, but the lyrics will be on the screen. So those of you who are at home can sing lustily. And those of you in the great room, I invite you to stand, and you can hum or sway or march, because we are singing the music of Arthur Sullivan without Gilbert. Merrily?
Gifts in the different
Once upon a time, there was a king. Now, since the service is about the Unitarian Universalist history, you might think there's no room for a king. But just you wait. The time is about 1568, 50 years after Martin Luther accidentally started the Protestant Reformation. He wanted to reform but not break the Catholic Church, and our setting is in Transylvania. The king is named John Sigismund, and while his father died, when John was a baby, he was raised by his mother, Queen Isabella. She was a wise woman who was really very open-minded about many things, including religion, and who encouraged John to be the same way. So John started out as a Catholic, but he sampled a few other religions, Calvinism, Lutheranism, among others. Then, out of religious curiosity, he decided there should be a debate amongst all those various religions. Now, this was not too long after the years of jousting, so you can imagine how the debate went, with banners and parades and all sorts of activities, starting at 5 o'clock in the morning and going on until sunset, after which, of course, all the debaters were exhausted and wanted to go home. But John had advised 10 days of debate, and that's what he got. So after 10 days, John got to choose the winner. Now, whom did he choose? He chose Team Arian, headed by preacher Francis David. Now, they were known to use reason, and their reasoning led them to adopt the heresy that was credited to the theologian Arius in the year 318. 318. That heresy was a belief in the unity of God rather than the Trinity. The unity of God rather than the Trinity. Do you get where I'm going? John even decided that he should join this rational religion, and that's how we got our first Unitarian king. Now, up until this time, the laws almost required that everyone in almost every kingdom had to be the same religion as the king, under punishment of death. But using his reason, John figured you couldn't threaten people into true belief. So in 1568, he issued the Edict of Torda, which proclaimed that every person in Transylvania was free to choose their own religion. And while, unfortunately, King John only lived another 3 years, by the time of his death, there were more than 300 Arian or Unitarian congregations in Transylvania. And while the next king of Transylvania was Catholic, and not nearly as open-minded as John, the train, so to speak, had left the station. And the Arian Unitarian faith soon had a huge following in Hungary and Poland, enough to be a threat to Catholicism. So when the Counter-Reformations came, it smashed it and almost obliterated it from historical record. But this free and rational faith continued on. It crossed the oceans, and of course kept moving westward to England, then 200 years across the pond to the United States, where it became an inspiration for our country's constitutional percept of separation of church and state. which we certainly hope will live happily ever after.
These are the words of Francis David, the minister who so powerfully converted King John Sigismund. And we're going to read this responsively. I will be reading the words that are white, and if you would please read along with Bob the words which are yellow. In this world, there have always been many opinions about faith and salvation.
You need not think alike to love alike.
There must be knowledge in faith also.
Sanctified reason is the lantern of faith.
Religious reform can never be all at once, but gradually, step by step.
If they offer something better, I will gladly learn.
The most important spiritual function is conscience, the source of all spiritual joy and happiness.
Conscience will not be quieted by anything less than trust and justice.
We must accept God's truth in this lifetime. Salvation must be accomplished here on earth.
God is indivisible.
Edge as Ishtan.
God is one.
King John Sigismund was a Transylvanian, the only king to be Unitarian. From his throne he did declarion, people could be either Roman or Arian.
So about 2,000 years ago, I'm trying to be where I can see my script and be 2 inches from the microphone. It's difficult. Well, in the 4th century, the early theologian Arius took exception to the concept of the Trinity, the idea that God was the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, 3 separate entities and somehow yet still one. And when it came to that debate, well, Arius lost the battle. But as far as we're concerned, he won the war because after all, here we are. The unity of God became a heresy that always had some proponents, including Catherine Vogel, an 80-year-old Polish woman who was burned at the stake in 1539 for denying the Trinity. We're told she died singing. That's right. Almost 30 years before the Edict of Torda, we had our first known Unitarian martyr, although certainly there have been many others over the prior 1,000 years. But despite the furious attempts by the Counter-Reformation, in other words, the Roman Catholic Church, the Radical Reformation, the one that went so far beyond what Luther had envisioned, continued to move westward, spurred by the Enlightenment and also by the printing press, which put the Bible into the hands of lay people who could now read it and decide what it contained and what it didn't contain and just what they thought about all that. And in England, along with King Henry VIII's Anglican Church, we now had separatist movements, people who felt the Anglican Church could never be reformed enough, and so they became the Pilgrims and left. And then there were the dissenting chapels, perhaps the most famous one being at Newington Green. And parenthetically, that chapter was walking distance from our son's Northern London apartment, and Lloyd and I attended there to Unitarian services. By the mid-1700s, it had Arian or Unitarian ministers, the most prominent one being Dr. Richard Price, a radical thinker who made his chapel a center for other radical thinkers and social reformers. Men from the American colonies, such as Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and John Adams came to chat with Reverend Price, and Mary Wollstonecraft, the author of A Vindication for the Rights of Women, was a parishioner. Joseph Priestley, whom we know as a man who discovered oxygen, was also a dissenting minister. The good folks of Birmingham burned down his house and his laboratory and ran him out of town for his beliefs, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So let's go back to those folks who were leaving England on their own in 1620, the Pilgrims, and then the deluge that began in 1629 to Salem, and in Boston in 1630. These Puritans did not come to promote religious freedom. They came to safeguard their own beliefs, which were Calvinistic. Calvinism, which centers on the depravity of humanity and a God all too willing to punish that depravity, is perhaps best described as the fear that someone, somewhere, is having a good time. The Puritans definitely believed that civic life and religion were one and the same thing, and they set up what was called the Standing Order in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That was a collection of all the Puritan churches, and it was supported by taxes. And if you didn't like the Standing Order and its theology, you were welcome to leave, as did Anne Hutchison and Roger Williams. Well, that does sound rather grim. But the Puritans did bequeath to Unitarians, and now UUs, quite a gift, the Cambridge Platform, by which we still essentially govern ourselves here at UUFNN. Less than 20 years after their New World migration, the Puritans started to wonder that, worried that if they weren't well organized, well, the English crown would probably come and make them be organized, and thus the Puritan ministers gathered in Cambridge in 1648 to define some rules for their governance. The first thing they had to decide was what to call themselves, and they called their churches Congregationalist because they were run by the congregation, which was really radical because up until then, churches had been run by priests and ministers. And indeed, this experiment in self-governance did help lead to the American Revolution, which is another story for another day. These congregations were not united by a creed, although of course it was assumed that everybody was Calvinist. Instead, they were united by a covenant, an agreement of how they were to be related to each other. And anyone who agreed to walk together in supporting that covenant could become a member, resulting in each congregation determining for itself, just as we do here, its conditions for membership. Each congregation could also choose or call its own minister, and congregations were also to ordain ministers. And those of you who were here, 15 years ago, when we called and then ordained Reverend Neil Anderson, know what an incredibly powerful experience that was for us. Ministers were given a free pulpit, the ability to say whatever they believed was true. And once ministers had that right, it was kind of hard to keep that right from the parishioners, even though some beliefs started to eventually to stray further and further from Calvinism. And thus, over the years, religious conformity gave way to diversity of belief. And by the year 1800, more than 80% of the Puritan churches in the Boston area were referred to as liberal Christian, and were increasingly given the derogatory name of Unitarian. So in 1819, Reverend William Ellery Channing, known as the father of American Unitarianism, preached his famous hour-and-a-half-long sermon on Unitarian Christianity, setting out the beliefs of the movement and deriding Calvinism for its inhumanity, unreason, and gloom. Within the next few years, churches, by a democratic vote, of course, declared themselves to be Unitarian, which would be liberal, or Congregationalist, which would be orthodox. And in 1825, the liberal churches formed the American Unitarian Association, with Channing as its first president. But remember Joseph Priestley, who was run out of Birmingham, England? He wound up in Philadelphia, where he helped to establish the first congregation that was actually founded as a Unitarian church in 1796, nearly 20 years earlier. Now, what about Universalism? It doesn't always get equal billing in this partnership, although a friend of mine who had been raised Universalist recalls calling her mother long distance, and in 1961, that was an expensive big deal. She called her mother saying, "Mom, Universalism comes second in the name," and her mother told her not to fret. She said, "Unitarian is merely an adjective." Actually, the Universalist heresy predates the Unitarian one. Arianism arose in the 4th century, but it was in the 3rd century that Origen of Alexandria, another early theologian, proposed the idea that no one would be condemned to eternal damnation. And within a couple of centuries, that belief, like the Unitarian belief, was forbidden. But there are no big names in the historic record of people who came to the defense of universalism. No kings, no theologians, only occasional itinerant preachers. Until the mid-18th century, when a Welsh Methodist minister named James Relly came to the conclusion that, to be brief, the death of Jesus had atoned for all humanity. Relly's influence was twofold. First, he wrote a book called Union, putting forth his belief, and this book traveled to the American colonies, where it had an impact on numerous people. Also, Relly mentored another Methodist minister named John Murray, and here is how we get the miracle story of how Universalism came to the U.S. John Murray, this Methodist minister, heard of a congregant who had taken up Universalist leanings, so he called upon her to dissuade her of her heresy. But instead, the woman put forth such a reasonable and forceful defense of universal salvation that Murray realized she was right. And with that encouragement from James Relly, Murray took up Universalist ministry. But things did not go well for Murray. First off, you have to realize that preaching the good news of telling people they weren't going to burn in hell actually made some people really, really angry. So Murray had to deal with that. Then his wife and child died, and as a result, bills piled up for the doctors, and he wound up in debtor prison. His brother-in-law paid for his release, but you know, Murray had had it by then. So in 1770, he decided he was going to get a fresh start in the American colonies, and he would never preach again. He booked himself passage on the ship Hand in Hand, which was headed for New York. But then, well, this is where the miracle stuff starts to happen. As the ship neared land, it was blown off course by some winds, which left it stuck on a sandbar near Good Luck Point, New Jersey. The captain asked Murray to go ashore and see if he could get fresh water and some food for the crew. So Murray rowed to shore, and there he met a farmer named Thomas Potter. Now, it just so happens that Thomas Potter had somehow become acquainted with the idea of universal salvation, and he was so enamored with the idea that he had built a small chapel on his property, confident that at some point a Universalist minister would appear to preach the message of salvation. You believe me? I've actually been to that chapel. In conversation, Potter was able to kind of wheedle out of Murray that, well, yes, he had been a minister, and well, yes, he had been a Universalist minister, but he was done preaching. And Murray was forceful in his refusal, but Potter was more forceful, and finally Murray agreed that if the winds did not come up by Sunday morning to release the ship from the sandbar, he would preach. And of course, the wind stayed calm, and Murray preached. And for a few years thereafter, Murray was an itinerant preacher in New Jersey, sometimes being run out of town for his heretical views about salvation. Eventually, he went to Gloucester, Massachusetts, where he helped to found the first church to be founded as a Universalist church in the U.S. And so, he is considered the father of American Universalism.
John sailed over the ocean. John Murray sailed over the sea. He just lost his wife and his family, and he was as sad as could be. Sail on, sail on, sail on, John Murray, sail on, sail on, sail on, sail on, sail on, John Murray, sail on, sail on. The ship was becalmed on a sandbar. The captain asked Murray to go to shore to get some fresh provisions. So off to New Jersey he rode. Row on, row on, row on, John Murray, row on, row on, row on, row on, row on, John Murray, row on, row on.
The farmer was named Thomas Potter. He quoted John Murray with glee. I know you can preach a fine sermon, God's grace for all humanity.
John wanted to part of this bargain. He no longer wanted to preach, but said he would talk if by Sunday the ship was still stuck in the breach. Stay calm, stay calm, stay calm, now fair wind, stay calm, stay calm, stay calm, stay calm, stay calm, now fair wind, stay calm, stay calm.
The ship stayed becalmed on that sandbar. John Murray was good for his word, with news of salvation for all souls. Universalist preaching was heard. Preach on, preach on, preach on, John Murray, preach on, preach on, preach on, preach on, preach on, John Murray, preach on, preach on.
Well, it probably doesn't surprise you that the history is actually much more complicated than that. Thomas Potter's Universalist faith did not arise in a vacuum. The year that John Murray was born, 1741, a French physician arrived in the U.S. and started preaching Universalist doctrine in eastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey. George de Beneville was the son of a Norman nobleman who worked in the English court, and Queen Anne was his godmother. By the time he was 12, he had been to sea, and his wide travels perhaps inspired his belief that glorious truths are to be found in every church and religion under the sun. He also had a vision of his sins being forgiven by Jesus and decided if he, such a great sinner, could be redeemed, surely all humanity would be redeemed, and he became a Universalist. Well, we already know that's a dangerous concept. At age 19, de Beneville was arrested for his preaching in France, and he was on the scaffold, the executioner ready with his axe, when a horseman came riding up with a reprieve from King Louis XV. So de Beneville continued his travels and his preaching, spending some time among German pietists, some of whom had Universalist leanings. They taught him that a religion should be of the heart rather than of the head. And a number of those pietists emigrated and could eventually be found among the Pennsylvania Dutch. So there had been an entire generation of itinerant preachers paving the way for Murray's arrival. Also, when Murray got to Gloucester, there already was a small group of people studying Universalism using James Relly's book, Union. So Universalism had already gotten a toehold in New England as well. It was not the word being preached by Harvard Divinity School educated ministers whose big, beautiful, white congregational churches were on the green of almost every town around Boston. Instead, it was a word being preached by self-educated farmers and country people. The most influential such preacher was Caleb Rich. Rich had a Congregationalist parent and a Baptist parent, and he wondered which of these two religions was true. And then he started having visions which revealed to him yet another religion, one which did not include hell. And then a vision of Jesus appeared to Rich saying, "Feed my people." So he started to preach. Hosea Ballou, as a youth, was converted by Caleb's preaching. And even though he too was self-taught, he became the most influential early theologian of Universalism. While Murray's view of people was that they were going to need some form of remediation from their sins before going to heaven, Ballou, like Rich, thought that it was once and done. Jesus had died for humanity's sins, and that was good enough. Ballou also heard the radical notions of Ethan Allen, of the Vermont Green Mountain Boys, and a Revolutionary War hero, whose book of 1784, Reason, the Only Oracle of Man, used reason not only to support the concept of universal salvation, but also to reject the doctrine of the Trinity. So now we have these two heresies hanging out, so to speak, for the first time that we know of in the same book. And we know that by 1795, Ballou was preaching a Unitarian form of Universalism. Nevertheless, Ballou took issue with the Unitarian view of salvation. For Universalists like Ballou, God was a loving father who would not be deterred by the fact that his children screwed up. He wrote, "Your child has fallen into the mire, and its body and garments are defiled. You cleanse it and array it with clean robes. The query is, do you love your child because you washed it? Or did you wash it because you loved it?" However, Unitarians, ever strivers, believed in the concept of salvation by character. In other words, people needed to work to clean up their own messes, constructing immoral lives for themselves. And thus, Unitarians believed that they had something to say about their own salvation. And this, of course, gives us the adage of the difference between Universalists and Unitarians, that Universalists believe God is too good to damn them, and Unitarians believe they're too good to be damned by God. Nevertheless, as time went on, there were a number of ministers who filled both Universalist and Unitarian pulpits. And Thomas Starr King, who was credited with saving California for the Union during the Civil War era, is known to have preached the first Unitarian and Universalist at the same time sermon in Virginia City in the 1860s. He was such a minister who filled both pulpits. And the large room in our education building is named for him. There even was some talk about merging the two faith movements in 1865, but it wasn't until 1899, about 100 years after Hosea Ballou introduced you and you to each other, that a joint commission pondered a possible merger. There were a lot of commonalities, such as the use of reason when forming one's beliefs, and an emphasis on social justice, but the merger was not consummated. In 1931, a second commission gave it another go. By this time, many Unitarian congregations had distinctly humanist leanings, and God was becoming optional. At the same time, the Universalist publication, The Universalist Leader, was pointedly renamed the Christian Leader, and it stated, "Always there will be faith in God, or there will be no Universalist church." There were other obstacles as well. Unitarians, particularly those Unitarians, particularly those in New England, who made up a majority of the membership, still had the Boston Brahmin aura about them, and they tended to view Universalists as kind of their country cousins. After all, Unitarianism was a religion of the head, while Universalism was a religion of the heart. And the Universalists, well, those country cousins had fewer members and less money, and they were afraid of being overshadowed by their city cousins. Nevertheless, the courtship of sorts continued, and in the 1950s, the youth of both denominations formed one group, Liberal Religious Youth, or LRY. Our own Jim McCormick had friends from his LRY days in Oklahoma till the end of his life. Professional religious educators from both faith movements formed the Liberal Religious Education Directors Association, of which I am still a member, although I assure you I wasn't around for its founding. I'm not quite that old. And then finally, in 1961, we two, TWO2, became one. And at the celebration of the merger, those assembled sang of two tranquil streams, meeting and flowing as one, but the stream has rarely been so tranquil. You've heard a history that includes few women and no people of color. If I had time to spend on the years from the mid-19th century on, there would be quite a few women and a handful of blacks. In March of 2017, and I will not go into the specifics, the UUA was rocked from within by accusations of white supremacy, clericalism, and patriarchy. Since in the coming months, UUFNN will be talking about the proposed 8th principle, which addresses some systemic racism, you should in time be hearing about what happened, and if not, ask me and I'll tell you. In the meantime, after Karen had asked me to do a service on Unitarian Universalist history and then said, well, the day would be one day prior to Valentine's Day, so could I make it kind of a love story? That's what you got. The story of a courtship of two small faith movements, children of the Radical Reformation, that eventually joined forces in their commitment to change the world.
Would you please join with me in community prayer and meditation? We ask those folks on Zoom, you are invited now to offer your prayers, your joys, and concerns in the chat box. You can remember not only your own challenges, or think about Reverend Karen on her sabbatical, or think of your cares, your concerns on this particular day. So we will meditate and think about those things as we open our hearts to spirit and light. If you will please join with me with your hand and your heart and your raised hand, may we gather all of these thoughts, these cares, these concerns, these connections. May we do it with spirit. May we do it with light. May we know that we are all connected. And so be it. Amen.
From you I receive, to you I give. Together we share, and from this we live.
For those of you in the great room, please stand for our closing song, the one that was sung in 1961 at the very first General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association, celebrating the merger of the two faith movements. Again, you can sway, hum, those at home can sing. Merrily.
As tranquil streams that meet and merge and flow as one to seek the sea, our kindred hearts and minds unite to build a church that shall be free. trust a dawning future more, and bids the soul in the search of truth, and venture boldly and explore. Prophetic church, the future waits your liberating ministry. Go forward in the power of love, proclaim the truth that makes us free.
And you can join hands virtually or otherwise for our benediction, and the announcements will follow the benediction. Born in 1835, Universalist minister Olympia Brown was the first woman ordained by any denomination. Here are her words. Stand by this faith, work for it, sacrifice for it. There is nothing on all the world so important as to be loyal to this faith, which has placed before you its loftiest ideals. Do not demand immediate results, but rejoice that we are worthy to be entrusted with this great message, that you are strong enough to work for a great true principle without counting the cost. Go on finding ever new applications of these truths and new enjoyments in their contemplation, always trusting in the one God which ever lives and loves. Be seated.
Thank you for joining us. Thankful for your open hearts on this beautiful day. For future programming, please watch your email. If you need support on Zoom, please contact us, and know there is an online card for those of you who are visiting us. Please share our link with those who are feeling isolated and may need connection. We have 2 in-person announcements. I'll ask Jackie Riley to make the first, and Lois Bianchi to offer the second.
Good morning. I'd like to invite you all to join us as we build an anti-racist culture here at UUFNN. We'll be reading the ARC group, the Anti-Racist Culture Reflection Group. We'll be reading this book here. So you want to talk about race? We start on Wednesday, 6:30 to 8. We'll meet every other week for discussions. And if anybody wants a book, I have an extra.
And now for some fun. Today, everyone is being recruited in this room in sending a special message to all our UUFNN families. Those here in the room are asked to take a tray. They're all ready to go. Pick up a tray and a plain white bag and go back to your seat and spend about 10 minutes, is all it's going to take, to decorate a beautiful Valentine, oopsie-doo, a beautiful Valentine bag for our UU families. People on Zoom may write a special family message in the chat, and it will be copied and added to the gift bag. Families, you can expect your special Valentine gift bag near your doorstep by tomorrow evening. Thanks everyone for making our UU families feel special on Valentine's Day. Thank you. Pick it up later.
The theme of hearts is all around us. May I remind you a little bit of the Rio Project? You heard the Border Justice team talk about that, and like to keep that in the front of your minds. Also like to remind you of the Verdi Posse and their need to Verdi Posse, thank you. Reno Posse, okay. The Reno Verdi Posse, Nevada. All right, okay. Anyway, they're always in need of juice boxes and snack bars and so forth and so on. And if you can contribute those to the box in between before at Wednesday at noon, that would be much appreciated. Again, we want to remind those on Zoom that there's coffee in 3 minutes. So please stay on for small group conversations, but also remember what Lois just told you about decorating your bag, and may you do it with love and appreciation. All right, thank you, and so be it. Namaste.